Programs and the director of the Peter S. Calico Center for the Study of the American Presidency. Both are in the Peter S. Calico School of Government, Public Policy, and International Affairs at Hofstra. And I am not sure that I can express with words my joy at seeing all of you in person and not on Zoom boxes. This is the first event that the Calico Center has hosted in person since March in this very room. And so it is such a delight to have everyone here today. Especially exciting is for a lecture on the American presidency from origins to the present. I'm not going to get into the specifics of our distinguished speaker, Dr. Stephen Knott from the U.S. Naval War College, except to give him a warm welcome back. He was last at Hofstra in the spring of 2015 for our conference on the George W. Bush presidency. And my distinguished colleague, Dr. Himelfarb, will be giving a formal introduction in just a moment. Let me just take one moment to offer thanks to the many individuals who have made this event possible, specifically the Hofstra Cultural Center, Athleen Collins and Carol Mallison in particular, who is so busy back there. Carol, I hope you'll get to sit down for a moment. This would not be possible without you. Let's just please just thank her for her fine work. The Hofstra Office of University Relations, our wonderful live streaming staff that is making this available for you to look at, and for people who are not able to join us today. Very great thanks to my many colleagues in the political science department who have brought their classes. Dr. David Green, American politics class here. It's so nice to have all of you. Professor Ostrow's first year seminar. I saw all of you last week, and it is good to have you here. Dr. Himelfarb's American Healthcare Seminar. Dr. Dudek's Comparative European Governments class, and Dr. Parati's Immigration, Politics, and Society class. And to everyone in the community who has taken the time to join us today, thank you very much. I will turn it over to Dr. Himelfarb, who is a member of our Calico Center Faculty Advisory Council, initiated and organized this event, and he will provide an introduction to our speaker and the plan for this afternoon. So, thank you.
Thank you, Meena. I echo your sentiments about being back here in person. It really is wonderful. Good afternoon. It's an honor to introduce Stephen Knott. Mr. Knott is a professor of national security affairs at the United States Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. Previously, he co-chaired the oral history program at the Miller Center for Public Affairs at the University of Virginia. Professor Knott is the author of numerous books and articles on the American presidency and national security. Professor Knott first came to my attention in 2012 with the publication of Rush to Judgment, George W. Bush, The War on Terror and His Critics, with many scholars at the time labeling Bush, quote, the worst president ever, unquote, and accusing him of presiding over a, quote, lawless presidency, unquote. Professor Knott's book serves as an eloquent and comprehensive refutation of such accusations. By placing Bush's actions in proper historical context, Professor Knott makes a convincing case that many of the criticisms of our 43rd president were ideologically motivated and unfair. Professor Knott's latest book is The Lost Soul of the American Presidency, The Decline into Demagoguery and the Prospects for Renewal. In it, he traces the devolution of the American presidency from the neutral, unifying office envisioned by the framers of the Constitution into the partisan, demagogic entity of today. Professor Knott argues that only by understanding how the decline of this institution occurred can we begin to contemplate remedies for its revival. Today, it is a pleasure to welcome Stephen Knott to Hofstra. Professor Knott.
Well, Thank you all. Thank you, Meena. Thank you, Richard. It's always a joy to come back to Hofstra. This is actually my third visit. I came here in 1988 as a relatively young graduate student for the Richard M. Nixon conference. So that was my first visit, and then as Richard mentioned, I was back here a few years ago for the Bush conference. Meena and Richard, all of you should be quite proud of what Hofstra has accomplished in terms of becoming a serious center for the study of the American presidency. Thank you for all the work that you do. So let me begin by noting what something that Richard just mentioned. This book really, I wrote it as a kind of lament for what has happened to the American presidency and to some extent to what has happened to the American political order writ large. In my view, things in that order are out of sort, and this is not simply due, and I want to make this clear right up front, this is not simply due to the election of Donald Trump. In fact, I first began thinking about this book in 2012, before Donald Trump was ever seriously considered as a potential presidential candidate. So in my view, the American presidency has lost its way, it's lost the respect it once held, and that predates Trump. So let me sort of outline what I mean by making this claim that we've lost our way, that the office has lost its way. Perhaps the best way to do that is to tell you the way Americans and American presidents once conceived of the presidency and how far we've drifted from that earlier, and I would argue healthier, conception of the presidency and of the American political order. And I'm going to talk a little bit here at the beginning about George Washington, obviously our first president, but also his sidekick, who's now a Broadway celebrity, Alexander Hamilton. Those two men, I think more than any other members of the founding generation, were responsible for creating this office of the presidency and launching it into the future. And the conception of the presidency that Washington and Hamilton had was that it was an office of sober expectation. In other words, it was not in the interests of the presidency or of the constitutional order to hype the potential for that office, to overstate or to boost expectations about what the presidency could deliver. They set some pretty very tangible limits regarding expectation of the office. And I'll flesh that out a bit more as we proceed here. They hoped that the American presidency and the entire federal government, which was rooted in consent, at least consent offered by white male voters in the original 13 states, but nonetheless, for its time, a government based on a conception of consent that certainly wasn't reflected in places in Europe, for instance. And the hope was that this federal government, while based on consent, would refine and enlarge public opinion, public sentiment. And both Washington and Hamilton were very concerned about the ability of demagogues. Hamilton speaks about this repeatedly in the Federalist Papers. The ability of demagogues, people who prey, political figures who prey on the emotion, on the base passions of the people in order to stir them up, in order to win an election. So playing on people's fears, playing on people's emotions, on their passions, to some extent playing on the worst in us in order to win an election. Hamilton and Washington were extremely fearful of the ability of demagogues to win high elected office and perhaps even undermine a republic. And so this kind of thinking permeates the Federalist Papers, and it permeated the thinking of Washington and Hamilton as they conducted this first American presidency. So as Hamilton said in the Federalist Papers, the president should not, quote, employ the little arts of popularity, end quote. The little arts of popularity, Hamilton meant, is a kind of pandering, again, to appeal either to your vanity as a voter or to appeal to what is worst worse in all of us as flawed human beings. And if the important thing was to create a system of choosing a president that would at least make it more difficult, ideally impossible, that a demagogue would rise to the highest office in the land. And so Washington and Hamilton were determined to leave a model for Washington's successors, in which Washington conducted himself in a dignified manner. Additionally, in addition to conducting himself, and they're all he's at this point, eventually it'll be she, but in addition to conducting oneself with dignity, the president also had a constitutional responsibility in Article 2 of the Constitution to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And that may put the president at odds with the public at times. A majority of the public may feel that a particular law is unfair, and there was a perfect example of that in Washington's presidency when in parts of western Pennsylvania, 1793 and 94, you had something called the Whiskey Rebellion, where whiskey distillers protested violently against the federal excise tax on the distillation of whiskey. And while we might sit here and have a debate over whether that tax was fair or not, the fact that these distillers resorted to violence led Washington and Hamilton to conclude that the president had not only the authority to put this rebellion, this violent rebellion down, but had an obligation to put it down, to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Now that's an example of resisting public opinion, at least in the portion of this country that felt that that tax was unfair. And while that may sort of rub us the wrong way in terms of hearing, we all like to think that the public always reasons correctly. The public will always come to the right conclusion. We live in a system that at least pays a lot of lip service to the idea of the consent of the governed. In the view of Washington and Hamilton, the one thing, their understanding of history was that republics tend to be undermined when majorities turn violent and turn their, not even necessarily violent, but begin to enact measures that discriminate against minorities. They can be economic minorities, religious minorities, racial minorities, what have you. These men, I think, possessed a healthy fear of the tyranny of the majority and understood that for the rule of law to prevail, it might require instances where the president had to suppress, even at times, or resist the beliefs of the majority. That's an awkward position to be put in, but Washington believed that in the end, for a republic to survive, the rule of law must prevail, not the rule of the majority. So they had this healthy fear of the tyranny of the majority, which I think we've unfortunately lost. Now that Hamilton and Washington conception of the presidency is going to be very quickly replaced by Thomas Jefferson and his revolution of 1800, as he called his election in 1800. Jefferson believed very much that the majority should govern. Jefferson was less taken with the idea that Hamilton and Washington had, that there might be occasions where the president would need to resist or rebuff the majority. Jefferson had far more faith in the wisdom of the people than did either Hamilton or Washington. And when he becomes president in the very disputed election of 1800, he sort of reverses the, I won't even say reverses, he completely removes the sort of Hamiltonian and Washington understanding of the president as a check on public opinion. He turns the Constitution on its head. Jefferson does not share their fears of the tyranny of the majority. And so Jefferson's presidency will be very much a popular, or we might even say a populist president. This is going to be a presidency that roots its legitimacy not in the Constitution, not in Article 2, not in provisions like taking care that the laws be faithfully executed. It roots the president's authority in the fact that a majority of the people had voted for him. And therefore, he was, in a sense, duty-bound to implement the will of the majority. I'm not going to bury you in a blizzard of quotes today, but just a quick one here from Jefferson. And this is something you would have never heard from either Hamilton or Washington. Quote, "Public opinion is the best criterion of what is best," end quote. Now look, again, I admit in a political order such as ours, we all like to think, and the fact is that it is ultimately based on consent. But the role of elected officials in a republic, again, is to refine and enlarge that opinion, and perhaps even in rare circumstances, as I said, resist it, if that's what the law requires. But Jefferson, by enlisting and engaging public opinion, in his view, that gives strength to the federal government, gives legitimacy to the American presidency, and Jefferson even argues that an energetic executive gathers its strength from the people. Just to give an example of Jefferson's faith in public opinion and in the majority, he believed that constitutions, whether at the state level, particularly at the state level, but perhaps even the American Constitution, should be revised every generation. That there should be a constitutional convention every 19 or 20 years. Because in Jefferson's view, the dead should not govern the living. So you and I should not be living under a constitution that was written in 1787. Again, that has its appeal, but it also opens the door, perhaps, to abuses from the majority who happens to be in a position to write that constitution every 20 years. So Jefferson opens the door to what I see as the beginning of a kind of decline in the office of the presidency. I'll just say it right up front. I suffer from Jefferson derangement syndrome, so you may want to take some of what I say with a little bit of a grain of salt, but I think I can defend my case. I think we sort of begin this decline, sorry enough to say, in 1800. Pretty steady. But Jefferson sort of opens the door. Andrew Jackson kicks it wide open. Jackson is a member of Jefferson's party. It's now called the Democratic Party at this point. And while Jefferson had argued that the majority should rule, Jackson turns this into a governing precept. He says the majority is to govern at all times. There should be as few impediments as possible. The majority will. And for instance, if the courts get in the way, including the Supreme Court, if the Supreme Court gets in the way of implementing the majority's view, then that is not the way the American system is supposed to work. And there's a reason why Jackson takes the Supreme Court, takes Justice John Marshall on more or less directly, seeing them as, in a sense, enemies of the regime. That is a radical transformation of the founders, certainly Washington and Hamilton's understanding of Republican government. But to make matters worse, in my view, Andrew Jackson fits the definition of a demagogue that I gave you a few minutes ago. He played on people's fears. He played on, I would say, racial and economic resentments. He kind of put these various groups together in his coalition that vaulted him into the White House. And nobody understood the fact that Andrew Jackson was a demagogue better than John Quincy Adams, his opponent in 1824 and 1828. Adams was a target of Jackson's wrath. And Adams, I think we should point out here, was a champion of the rights of free blacks in the North to vote. He was far more of a champion of the rights of Native Americans than Jackson was by any stretch. And Adams understood that unpopular minorities bear the brunt of populist of a populist president. And I would say that John Quincy Adams was one of the last of a dying breed who understood the threat presented by the tyranny of the majority and tried to warn the American public of the dangers presented by Andrew Jackson. According to John Quincy Adams, Jackson was, quote, a man governed by passion rather than reason. He was, quote, a demagogue, end quote. So with Jackson's election to the American presidency, and with the wider success of Jackson's movement at both the state and local level, what you began to see was a steady process where the majority used its power at the state level to disenfranchise an unpopular minority, in this case, free blacks who voted primarily in the Northeast. And Jackson's party, not so much perhaps Jackson himself, but Jackson's party, began to press for the expansion of slavery. And they did this by leveraging their powers at the state and federal level to also remove an equally unpopular minority from its midst, Native Americans. And I'm sure all of you are familiar with Andrew Jackson's famous Trail of Tears, where the Cherokee Indians in what was then southwestern United States were forcibly marched into what is now Oklahoma on what I think we can accurately describe as a death march. So as I mentioned earlier, the personification of this theory that the majority is to govern at all times in the American early republic is Andrew Jackson. But again, keep in mind that this majority coalition that he assembled was at bottom a cauldron of boiling partisan, racial, and class resentment. And in Jackson's case, he shared those resentments, plus he shared the resentments of a lot of frontiersmen of his day against what he considered to be Eastern elites in places like New York City and Boston. 30 years later, and so I grant you I'm jumping ahead here, we're covering a lot of history in a quick period of time. But 30 years later, Jackson's fellow Tennessean, Andrew Johnson, who succeeded Abraham Lincoln in the presidency, and who considered Andrew Jackson to be his ideal politician and an ideal president. Andrew Johnson is going to stir the same populist pot on his path to power. He rises to prominence, and if I offend anybody's sentiments here, I apologize, but Johnson arises to prominence as the 19th century's version of Donald Trump. One abiding characteristic of Jackson, Johnson, my view, Trump, one abiding characteristic of these populist, demagogic presidents is their propensity to circulate conspiracy theory. In the case of Andrew Jackson, it was the monster bank, as he called it, the Bank of the United States, which did have problems, not excusing everything about the bank. But Jackson presented a complex issue in very simplistic terms, but more importantly, in very conspiratorial terms. Andrew Johnson had a view of the United States, of the American political order, that was also rooted in conspiracy theories. He was convinced that somewhere there was an East Coast elite that was determined to prevent people like him from Tennessee from rising to positions of power. He begins to see the radical Republicans after the Civil War as these people. And then finally, and again, I'm jumping ahead here quite a bit, but you see the same conspiratorial musing in Donald Trump, who spoke repeatedly of a deep state that was out to undermine common Americans, that was committed to an international order that was determined to undermine American sovereignty, things such as that. And of course, Trump also circulated stories about, Ted Cruz's father killing President Kennedy and things. This type of populist demagogic presidency, which I've belabored now for close to a half an hour or so, there were alternatives. And I already mentioned John Quincy Adams, obviously Washington, but the other alternative, of course, was Abraham Lincoln, who falls between Andrew Jackson and Andrew Johnson. And Lincoln was horrified at the violence and the lawlessness that racked this country during the Jackson years. Lincoln is a young state-level politician in Illinois during the Jackson presidency, and then eventually becomes a congressman from Illinois. It's the Jackson era that motivates Lincoln to enter politics. And by the way, it's no accident that Lincoln serves as an honorary pallbearer at John Quincy Adams's funeral. He admired John Quincy Adams very much. Lincoln, I would argue, was our most literate president, but he also understood the virtues of silence, of restraint, of moderation. He avoided the politics of personal destruction, which Andrew Jackson and Andrew Johnson thrived on. Lincoln was a champion of cold, hard reason and was extremely dismissive of conspiracy theory. And so if you're looking for a good 19th century example or an alternative to this populist presidency that I'm bemoaning today, you'll find it in Adams, Washington, and Lincoln. Nevertheless, despite those very positive examples that I just gave you, as we entered the 20th century, because Jefferson, Jackson, Johnson, some others, had kind of unmoored, unanchored, is such a word, the presidency from the Constitution and grounded it in public opinion. It was a small step for Andrew Jackson's heirs to claim that not only did the president speak for the majority, but if the people demanded a federal government that could be as big as it wanted to be to confront the economic powerhouses of the day, the Gilded Age giants, then really there were no limits whatsoever to what the federal government could do or what a modern American president could do. And you see this primarily, you see this kind of thinking primarily in the political thought of Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. Wilson flat out states that the American president was as big a man as he wanted to be. In other words, there were really no limits to what the American president could take on in that office. Now, while Jefferson and Jackson did not share Wilson and TR's faith in the federal government, they all shared this belief that the president spoke for the majority and that the president should be as big a man as he wanted to be. And so in the 20th century, you have a series of American presidents, again, beginning with TR and Wilson, and really peaking under Franklin Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson, who begin to see Andrew Jackson as a precursor, as a 19th century precursor to Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal, or perhaps even the Great Society. So even though the presidency of Andrew Jackson is a century prior to Franklin Roosevelt, both men fought the elites of their day and considered themselves to be the tribune of the people. And as with Andrew Jackson, Franklin Roosevelt was a genius at firing up his base by labeling his opponents as un-American evildoers and by attacking the Supreme Court. It's no accident that Jackson, Jefferson, Roosevelt, Andrew Johnson, there's one consistent, well, there's more than one, but one of the consistent themes is they viewed the Supreme Court and the American judiciary as an impediment to the will of the majority. So it's always important to note that the rule of law is seen by an impediment to demagogue and is frequently going to be subject to attack, particularly the courts are going to bear the brunt of these attacks. Now jumping ahead even further, and I've already made it clear where I stand on the Trump presidency, but I would argue that Donald Trump represents the epitome or the apotheosis of those who fought for a more responsive, unrestrained presidency, rooted in public opinion, and fond of circulating conspiracy theory. This refounded presidency that begins slowly with Jefferson, accelerates under Jackson, and really takes off in the 20th century, I believe, placed the American presidency on an unsustainable and dangerous path, a path of heightened expectations that, in other words, the presidency can solve any problem that it's confronted with. And here I'll show my bipartisanship, I hope, in that Barack Obama, when he accepted the Democratic Party's nomination for president in 2008, said that this was the moment at which the oceans around the world would begin to cool. That kind of over-the-top thinking, that one election, one individual has the power to change any problem or deal with any crisis confronting the world, I think has contributed to the collapse in confidence in the American government when it fails to deliver. When you heighten expectations so high and then you cannot deliver, there's been a steady erosion of the American public's confidence, not only in the presidency, but in the federal government writ large. I would also say this sort of unfettered populist presidency diminished the important role that presidents, mostly in the 19th century, the important role that presidents played as a unifying head of state. Once Andrew Jackson began to view his opponents as evildoers, and you had a kind of partisanship that takes hold, and that was seen as a positive thing for a president to engage in, the role of the president as this unifying figure was on its way to extinction. And so by changing or transforming the presidency into a partisan leader, the office becomes a perpetual partisan lightning rod. And again, this has contributed to an erosion of respect for the office. So I'm looking forward to taking your questions, but let me conclude by saying I believe the United States, the American presidency, would be well served to return to the constitutional presidency of a Washington or a Hamilton or a John Quincy Adams. Again, because they designed a presidency of sober expectations, one that did not pander to or manipulate public opinion, one that was opposed to the notion that it was the president's job to provide some sort of vision to take us into the promised land. And perhaps most importantly, this was an office that was less likely to implement the majority will at the expense of political, racial, and economic minorities. Now, that all sounds grand, perhaps, but how can we possibly get back to that kind, or at least elements of that earlier vision? I grant you, it's an uphill battle. There were a couple of examples in the 20th century. Believe it or not, I think somewhat highly of William Howard Taft, who's somebody you're never going to see on Mount Rushmore, but he had certain merits. He understood this earlier vision or view of the office. I think Dwight Eisenhower incorporated elements of it into his presidency. So I think a recovery of this constitutional presidency, respectful of the rule of law, appreciative of the role of the president as a head of state, is within our reach. But again, it would require all of us as American citizens to resist, as I said, the siren call of demagogues, and it perhaps requires all of us to reconsider the limits of the American presidency and the limits of the federal government. And on that note, I'll stop, and hopefully I've generated some questions from all of you. Thank you. I think you can come up to the mic. If I promise I won't bite, so.
Thank you, Professor Knott.
Sure.
I know there are going to be many questions. I have several.
Sure.
I think Dr. Himelfarb, did you want to go up to start the discussion, or we'll just all go here? Okay. Well, then you can, students, you may come up here and line up for your questions. I guess I'll start with the first since I have the microphone. Would you tell us what your conception, the Hamiltonian, Washingtonian conception of the American presidency means for proposed reform. And I know you started to refer to this, and so I'm
Yeah.
going to come up. But particularly, this came up in 2000, 2016, 20, the Electoral College, the relevance of which, in
Yeah.
all fairness, plus I won classes, I think, discussed is decided by the Committee on Postponed Matters, not necessarily a grand scheme of presidential. So
Right.
I guess maybe I'll take that as a starting point of what you think that would be. Whether that is an area where perhaps the idea of reform, the framers didn't have it all conceived
Yeah.
long term in 17.
Yeah. So, look, I know the Electoral College is about as popular today as sedation-free root canals, but the original conception of the Electoral College, at least as Hamilton conceived it, and you're right, it was a bit of an afterthought at the Constitutional Convention. The founders were concerned that when you're selecting a president, particularly in the 1780s and 90s, you know, this is a country that at that point extended from present-day Maine down to present-day Georgia. Well, Maine was part of Massachusetts at that point. But the point was that other than George Washington and Ben Franklin in 1787, most Americans outside of their own state, they never would have heard of Hamilton or Jefferson or Adams. These are not national figures. So they wanted some body that actually knew who the potential presidents were once you move beyond George Washington. So they came up with this idea of this electoral college where state legislators would select electors every 4 years. They, in turn, would select a president. And hopefully these would be sort of the best and brightest from each of the communities. They would pick these people who were known for integrity and character and competence. All right, that was the original conception. It lasted at best until 1804, okay? So what happened after the Electoral College was sort of undermined by the Jeffersonians. That was one of their tangible efforts to make our system more democratic. In fact, Jefferson toyed with the idea of direct election of the president. Never quite came to formally propose what he considered. But the point was that this idea of some sort of intermediary body composed of the best and bright, you know, that wasn't going to work. And so, but what happened in terms of placing the election was that the political parties sort of stepped into the void, and they began to serve that screening function. They began to pick the people who were competent, hopefully had some integrity, didn't have problems with alcohol or whatever, okay? So the parties, in a sense, in the 19th and early 20th century, began to serve the role that Hamilton foresaw the Electoral College. Unfortunately, today, we've reached the point where we've democratized the presidential selection process so much that you can have a situation like you did in 2016, where Bernie Sanders, who's not, or was not, or is not a member of the Democratic Party, almost won the nomination for that party. And Donald Trump, who showed no track record of being a Republican, did win it. And so the entire screening process that the parties once performed, that's all gone as well. So one of the changes I would love to see would be a kind of restoration, and I know this isn't particularly that popular, but I would like to see some restoration of that screening process given back to the party leaders so that you don't end up with people who should be nowhere near the Oval Office. That was kind of a long-winded answer, I grant you, but right now I would argue we sort of have the worst of both worlds. We still have this Electoral College, but it doesn't serve the original intention that it was designed for. And at the same time, we have all these elements of popular selection in terms of nomination process and so forth. I think it merges them too, and it's not a great system.
Thank you. No, it is. I have
helpful.
several follow-ups. I'll defer.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
you do have. Thank you.
Somebody be brave. You get
Hello,
a gold
Professor Knott.
star for today.
Thank you for thank you for coming and speaking
Sure.
today.
Sure.
Dr. Bose stole my first question, so I will ask this other question. In looking you up on Google before you came to speak with us today, I noticed you had written. Actually, correct me if Google's wrong about this. You had written a biography on Alexander Hamilton.
Correct.
And reading the synopsis of it on Amazon, it seemed very similar to what I had learned of Hamilton, actually in the musical.
Yeah.
It the writer of the musical, inspired by Ron Chernow's biography. I wanted to ask, what did you think of the musical?
I loved it.
You loved it.
My wife and I saw it 3 times. She loves it more than I do, but I'm not a big fan of musicals, but I did like it. So Ron Chernow's book that Lin-Manuel Miranda read 16 years ago, whatever, and inspired this musical. Ron Chernow's book, not to blow my own horn here, but I was in touch with Chernow while he was writing that thing. This is my one brush with great. Unfortunately, I didn't get a penny from any of it. But there are some mistakes in the musical. I could spend some time talking.
That was going to be my
Yeah.
question.
Okay. Well, I think it portrays Hamilton more pro-immigrant than he actually was. It seems to suggest that he may have been a champion of open borders. I think that's going a little too far. He shifted his position in the early 1790s. He favored increased immigration to the United States to fill the factories that he hoped would fuel the United States becoming an economic power. Late 1790s, when it appears we're about to go to war with France, he starts talking about stricter immigration enforcement. Well, there really wasn't any immigration enforcement, but the government needed to be on guard against French citizens who might come to the United States for purposes of subverting the U.S. government. So he's a little bit, his position changed over time. So I do think Lin-Manuel and Ron Chernow perhaps overstate Hamilton's commitment to immigration, or to immigrants. The other thing, unfortunately, I think they both overstate, is Hamilton was not an abolitionist, I would argue. Now, some folks may disagree, but he certainly was anti-slavery. But I would never, it seems to me there's kind of the implication that he was something of an abolitionist. I think that's going too far. Yes, he was anti-slavery. Yes, he proposed during the American Revolution as a soldier, he proposed that slaves be given their freedom in exchange for fighting for the Continental Army, which was a pretty radical proposal for his day. Yes, he was very sympathetic to the Haitian slave uprising led by Toussaint Louverture, much more sympathetic to the Haitian Revolution than Jefferson and Madison were, for obvious reasons, I think. And other founding member of the New York Society for the Manumission of Slaves, 1785, he and John Jay and some others. Very concerned about the fate of refugees from Haiti after that revolution. So, I mean, there's a really good track record, I think, for his time. Alexander Hamilton had a very progressive record on racial matters. He's not Frederick Douglass. He's not, however, he's not somebody who is putting it at the top of his agenda. At the top of his agenda was trying to make this fragile union and this fragile Constitution a success. And that was a major challenge. So that was first and foremost for him. These other issues came secondarily. I think Lin-Manuel Miranda and Chernow, again, overstate those two issues, immigration and slavery. One final thing I'll mention, and this one drives me crazy with the musical, because Ron Chernow included a story about Alexander Hamilton's alleged serial adultery. This will wake everybody up. People are starting to doze. He included a story that said that Martha Washington named her horny tomcat Hamilton. It's in there. Now, if you've seen the musical, the one time the Hamilton character breaks out of character, he stops, he looks at the crowd and says, "It's true. It's not true." And that gets under my skin. I know it's a kind of a small thing, but it's part of this effort to portray Hamilton, as a serial adulterer, as a man of not particularly good character. And it's completely fake. The original story that said that Hamilton, Martha Washington named this Randy Tomcat Hamilton, it was a satirical piece in a British newspaper that also said that George Washington had 13 toes, one for each of the newly independent states. Does that sound real to you? Legit? So this is a great example of how myths circulate over time. And unfortunately, Lin-Manuel Miranda gave it renewed life. But thanks for that question.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Sure.
Thank you so much for this this talk. It's been
Sure.
so illuminating. You talked about our responsibility to resist the call of
Yeah.
demagogues, and also about the failure of the institutions of the political parties to properly vet candidates,
Yeah.
do what we think parties are supposed to do. What about Congress? I have a class here that's studying immigration policy.
Sure.
And presidents are so powerful in immigration policy despite the Constitution because Congress has actually ceded power to the president.
Sure.
Is that wrong? And does Congress have the capacity to do what we expect it to do on immigration?
Congress, so I didn't mention this in my formal remarks, but one of the costs of this unbridled presidency and this notion that the president should be as big a man as he wants to be, eventually as big a woman as he wants to be, is that Congress has turned into, it's been neutered. And so Woodrow Wilson in particular wanted to see Congress become neutered, in a sense. He wanted the president to serve as a kind of de facto majority leader or Speaker of the House. You were expected, if you were a Democrat, to give your loyalty to a Democrat in the White House and vice versa for the Republicans. And so what that has done is eroded the power of Congress. They've certainly been co-conspirators in this. I mean, they've willingly gone along. They have the constitutional authority to push back on whether it's immigration or war powers or you name it. But look what happens every time the White House changes party composition. You'll get people protesting Trump action against that Iranian guy that they killed, Soleimani or whatever his name was. Republicans back Trump on it. Some Democrats question it. Joe Biden does a similar type thing. Democrats support the action. So the Congress has allowed itself to become, I would argue, a kind of partisan. They have allowed when their president, when their party controls the Oval Office, they have allowed him to become their de facto leader. And so, we're reaping the whirlwind of, at the very least, it begins with Woodrow Wilson, which is now 100 years in the rearview mirror, of Congress giving away its authority on partisan ground, which, by the way, is exactly what Hamilton and Washington warned about in Washington's farewell address. And by the way, that's a speech that people should go back and take a look at, like a window into 2021 America. In that speech written by Washington and Hamilton, actually yesterday was the 225th anniversary of it, I believe. They warn of partisanship, the perils of partisanship, the perils of political parties dominating or sort of being motivated on emotional grounds and partial interest, not the national interest. But most importantly, it's a warning against. It's a warning for all Americans to keep the national interest at the forefront and put partisan interests, they shouldn't even be a factor, according to Washington and Hamilton. You may consider that naive. Maybe they were. But I'm telling you, if you want Congress to step up to the plate on immigration or war powers or whatever it is, they're going to have to stop deferring to the president as their party leader. And look at the real, in my view, scary downside to President Trump's very impressive takeover of the Republican Party, impressive in terms of raw politics. The fact that, 10 Republicans broke rank and had the brass to vote for impeachment that was January 4th. Liz Cheney's basically by herself in the House. Kevin McCarthy and Mitch McConnell, although McConnell keeps distance from Trump. But, that's the price of allowing the president to become your de facto leader. You can't even impeach somebody who, in my view, encouraged an insurrection. That's bad. That's not a help. I hope that was somewhat helpful. Hi.
Hi, thank you for coming today.
Sure.
I have two questions, but you kind of answered my first one just now because it had to do with political parties. So I'm just gonna
Sure.
kind of pivot it. At what point in history do you think there was a flip that became much more partisan and political parties have allowed for the presidency to become more demagogic?
Yeah, I mean, again, the door kind of opens under Jefferson. Jefferson believes that Hamilton and the Federalists are monarchists. They're pro-British, if not outright British agents. So Jefferson literally, in his private conversation, says we're going to destroy the Federalist Party. And they did. I'm not a big fan of his, but as a politician, the guy was first rate. So the Federalists are gone by pretty much by 1816. They run a presidential candidate, but they get slaughtered. So Jefferson, most of the founders, if you talked to them in the 1780s, would have said political parties are not a good thing. And even Jefferson would. By the early 1800s, when he's in the White House, he's seeing some benefit from at least his political party. Now, what he hoped would happen is that eventually his own political party would wither away, and all Americans would share a kind of Jeffersonian vision. That didn't happen. But that's where the door opens. Andrew Jackson takes it light years beyond Jefferson, in that Jackson is very much a believer in these kinds of personal assaults, politics of personal destruction, viewing your political opponents not just as opponents, but as enemies, as traitors. So again, in my view, it starts with Jefferson. Jackson raises it to a whole new level, and then it becomes the norm in the 20th century from politicians who admire both Jefferson and
I have another question.
Sure.
Concerning the rise of the internet and the spread of mis and disinformation, do you think we need to take action now to prevent the presidency from becoming more demagogish, or the internet kind of allows for a future where it's a lot more easier, just with how we've seen conspiracy theories
Sure.
and everything in that range spread over the past couple of years?
Yeah, I won't have a good answer for you, and certainly President Trump made incredibly effective use of Twitter before he was bounced off, of social media. President Obama started doing that as well, but again, Trump really, I think, took it to a whole new level. I don't know what the answer is. I mean, I'm a believer in the First Amendment, so I'm very reluctant to say there are steps that the government should take. I wouldn't say that at all. What it counts on is that you and I, as citizens, reject the disinformation that just permeates social media, and we now know for a fact that foreign governments are using our own social media against us to spread this disinformation. Sure, thank you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thanks for coming today. Welcome to Hofstra.
Thanks.
Just a question. You talked earlier about the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
And, when Jackson didn't get the second bank through the Supreme Court, and he railed against them. We saw it with Franklin Roosevelt and his labor standards bill. We see some of that today, and we see some of that in the previous, that they expect the Supreme Court to be, they expect the court to be part. of the executive branch and the
That's
legislature,
correct.
not to be independent,
That's correct.
separate independent branch. Do you see that happening today? Because I think I do. You do?
So Franklin Roosevelt flat out said in the midst of his whole court packing plan in 1936-37 that the Supreme Court should pay attention to election results. I mean, that is as far removed from not just the intentions of the framers, but I believe the intentions of anyone who's a fan of Republican government or a government that protects the rights of individuals. Court. You don't want the courts to be reading election results and acting accordingly. Now, do they on occasion? Of course, unfortunately. But should an American president be endorsing that as a principle? Absolutely not. And look, there are problems. I have issues with the judicial branch. I think they've overreached at times. They too need to, I think, develop a deeper understanding of the limits of their own power and of the power of the federal government. But the politicized court that we have today, and no question we have it, has been fueled in part by presidents, including Franklin Roosevelt. He's not alone.
But when we talk about the devolving of the presidency, is the Congress, partisan Congress with the president, the same party or whatever, they'll use their advantage? Are they going to change this? You think this will result in changing the court, either expanding it or making them elected, or doing something that, reduces their independence from the other branches of government?
I suppose that's a possibility. I don't think I would favor that, but I know it's a common topic, certainly after President Trump managed to put 3 people on the court in 4 years, including Amy Coney Barrett last fall with the election a month away. I get the anger, but I think in my view, those changes would be worth the problem.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'd like to go back to this issue of the demagogue for a moment.
Sure.
I've been a student of the radical right for a long time, and what I notice now is that conversations with these folks have kind of devolved into ultimately the statement that Donald Trump was sent to us by God to save America.
Yeah.
And that's not just a statement verbally expressed,
No, I've seen
but
it.
one that I've seen in writing over and over and over again. So it's sort of hard to create rational discourse when the ultimate answer is expressed in the form of religion, where there is no answer. There is nowhere where you can go beyond that. That's the end of the argument. Carrying this to another level, some 65% of registered Republicans now believe fervently in the big lie.
Yeah.
And some 35% of those believe that, quote, American patriots ultimately will have to resolve that by violence.
Yeah.
That worries me.
Well, it should.
And it worries me because ultimately these are the folks with the guns. And I guess my question for you is, do you see a point where people who become frustrated by the fact that what they believe can't get resolved in any way through the electoral process, that is, through the results of an election, assuming that's the case, become so frustrated that the only way that they can solve that is to pick up guns, and we end up with something approaching, whether it's called that or not, a civil war?
Yeah. I'm going to provide an unsatisfactory response to you because I share most of your fears. we have made it through. We did make it through our first civil war, where the system broke down. But what you put your finger on goes back to what I was trying to say before in my prepared remarks. When you set up a presidency that emphasizes the importance of the presidency, the be-all and end-all of our system. In fact, in the 20th century, it was commonly referred to, our system was referred to as a system of presidential government. People like James McGregor Burns and Arthur Schlesinger Jr., a lot of liberals were on board with the idea that the presidency should drive the train. Once you knock those barriers down, and once you have I was going to say a selection process. We don't really have a selection process for party nominees anymore. It's whoever can fire up the base. Donald Trump fired, to his credit, fired up the base in 2016 and again in 2020. And he won in 2016 by firing up the base. And, you know, what was the few Republican leaders, even, you know, Lindsey Graham, others did speak out at the time saying this guy should be nowhere near the Oval Office. And most of them now have gone over to stuff. But that's the problem when you enshrine this, in my view, Jacksonian, Wilsonian conception of the presidency. You make it, you inflate the power of the office, you put it all on the personal qualities of the person running for president. Does he have charisma or not? Wilson talked all the time about charisma, and he had a lot. And I didn't see charisma in Trump either, but he obviously had it for some folks. And if that's the basis of your selection, then we're in trouble. We've got a deeply flawed system. And I flat out say in this book, we had a lot of mediocrities in the 19th century. You know, Benjamin Harrison, arguably, and maybe there's a Harrison fan in the audience, but or a Hayes fan, or who knows. But, you know, those guys might have been mediocrities, but they did no harm. They left after 4 years. The office was still intact. The Constitution was still intact. I would take those mediocrities any day over a Trump. But we've put ourselves in a position where, you know, it could happen again. And by the way, it could happen on the Democratic side. I realize that's I share your fears. We've put ourselves in this position, and God willing, we'll get ourselves out of it. I don't have a nice, easy answer for you, other than everyone read The Lost Soul of the American President.
Yeah, going further with his point, I've actually noticed a lot of that myself. I figured that for someone who has actually been watching politics, and also watching, I've also been able to enjoy and actually look at both sides of the aisle very, very,
Sure.
trying to watch. I've noticed, like, especially ever since, like, that both sides of the base, it's what some people would describe as like truth in a sense, which I would say that, you know, both sides see the other as the ultimate enemy. They're a horrible human being. They're going to destroy the country. They're going to kill your babies and all this other shit, all this stuff. So all this other stuff, it's absolutely insane. Like, how much of it do you see in many ways? Would you say that the base of Bernie, the base of Trump are very similar in many regards? What ways would you say they're really in regards to how?
Well, you're going to get me in trouble with that one, but I wasn't a fan of Bernie Sanders. Look, Richard, I wrote a book defending George W. Bush's conduct of the war on terror. Okay, I'm not your typical, stereotypical liberal academic by any stretch. Okay, so I understand. I have friends, family, small number of academics who are quite conservative. So I like to think that I can kind of see it from, as you were saying, from both sides. But where I've always pulled back, where I've always, what I've always recoiled from, is people who portray their opponents as the enemy. Because that is a prescription for civil war. That is a prescription for nonstop violence. It's a prescription for the end of the rule of law. And what particularly bugged me about Donald Trump was that he embraced that with a passion. He embraced the idea of labeling his opponent as enemy. The media is the enemy of the people. So in particular, sometimes he would call out particular politicians as being the enemy, or engaging almost in treason. That is just so far removed from the founders' conception, and forget the founders, from a healthy conception of how politics in a republic should be conducted. And it's incredibly dangerous. The media loves it. There's a quote from Les Moonves, who was president of CBS News, 2016, talking about how great Trump was for rape. I mean, they loved it, and they partly fueled his rise to power. That's a separate issue. So it may be great entertainment, but in the long run, I think it's extremely dangerous. And no president should engage in the kind of weaponized language from.
No,
Well,
I was saying the whole sentence.
Just on a policy level, I don't agree with a lot of Sanders' proposals. Is he as, I mean, I'm trying to recall him both in 2020 and 2016. I don't remember him engaging the kinds of personal attacks that Trump did. So if I equated him, I would draw. I just didn't like his policies on most. Thanks.
You for being here
Sure.
and bringing up these issues. I have an easy question and a hard one. And the easy one, when you mentioned Wilson and Franklin as being in the demagogues and thinking that the president should do whatever he wanted to do, you did not include Richard Nixon, who said it verbally.
Yeah, no.
And
That was just, I'm sorry, go ahead.
well, I was wondering why not.
Yeah.
And that's the easy question.
Oh, boy. I've got a section on Nixon in the book. I am not at all a sympathizer. I mean, Richard Nixon, I have no sympathy whatsoever for Nixon I mean, he was Eisenhower's hatchet man as vice president. Some of the rhetoric he employed as president was polarizing. He intentionally picked a vice president, Spiro Agnew, who he knew would go out and beat up the liberals. That's exactly what the politics I'm trying to say is dangerous and destructive.
Okay, and the hard one, of course. How do you return to a Washingtonian Adams Hamilton era when the white supremacist outrage over Obama's election, followed by Trump's enthusiastic divisiveness that is still permeating the political landscape? How are you going to bring those things together? And you said that's where we need to go, so you're on.
Look, I think there's a chance that if somebody were to run for president, and it's not going to be me, and said, I'm not going to promise you the world, I'm not going to promise things that the federal government can't deliver on, I'm not going to pit one American against another, and in fact, I'm going to govern in kind of a 19th century style. I'm going to focus on good administration, good government. I'm not going to, if maybe a candidate like that would would catch on, maybe. I don't know, because the track record shows frequently that the candidate who outpromises and who stirs up the base secures the nomination, which is controlled by activists who don't necessarily represent, well, maybe they do now, but in the past didn't represent the mainstream. So maybe that kind of alternative candidate can catch on. But again, ultimately, this is on all of us. We have to get back to, at least start to understand that there was a different way, and it doesn't have to be the way it is today.
So thank you for coming today. You kind of were starting to get on the point that I was going to ask about, which was simply, we see obviously there's a lot of problems that are both Republican and Democrat, and both parties have a lot of issues with each other, and it creates a lot of divisiveness. I was wondering, kind of two parts. One, if it's possible, and two, if it's realistic, do you think the formation of a new political party or parties could possibly be the solution to the issues that face us today with the presidency?
That's a great question. You know, this is where my kind of late conservatism comes out. I like to think that we can salvage the two-party system because I think it does have some merit. So that's not necessarily a popular thing to say in a lot of quarters. For me, that's not the answer. Now, is it possible that that kind of candidate that I just mentioned in response to the previous gentleman's question, who could not win within the current Democrat or Republican Party and forms a third party? You know, maybe. But you know, my answer is we've got institutions that have proven they can work in the past. And again, this might be just my conservative nature. I would rather see these two existing parties, one may be beyond salvaging at this point, as far as I'm concerned. But I would like to see them put back in place. In simple terms, it could be super delegates, they used to call them. I guess they still have them. Give the party leaders who know who the competent people are, who know who the ones are who have psychological or problems with drugs or alcohol, whatever, and or just lack integrity. Put these people back in a major role in terms of selecting the nominees of these parties. So that's my answer. I'd like to see the current two-party system prevail. Whether that's going to happen or not, though, I'm not so sure. Good question. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Once again.
Sure.
You indicated earlier that President Obama may have set up false hopes for the American people, like promising to solve the rising ocean temperatures or Guantanamo.
Yeah.
And a lot of that stuff did not get done. And do you think, sort of a two-part question, do you think presidents should set very almost unobtainable goals and aspirations? And obviously Trump, he took that step further. He promised to build the wall. He promised to
We'd all start saying Merry Christmas again.
Yeah, fix every trade deal. He'll conquer the moon. He'll do a whole lot of stuff. And do you think it's possible for us to sort of move the faith in the presidential promise back to sort of restore it?
I do think it's possible, but again, it's going to require the American people to be partners in this effort. In other words, to stop rewarding those politicians who overpromise, who raise expectations beyond any reasonable level. And I don't know. I don't know. Again, I've got my scenario where we might try to get somebody out there who says some of the themes that I've talked about today. Maybe he or she would catch on. But the inflation of presidential rhetoric, and I've got a lengthy chapter in the book about John F. Kennedy, who I'm also currently writing a book about, and some aspects of President Kennedy I admire. But President Kennedy engaged in incredibly inflated rhetoric. I mean, look at his inaugural address, that this country will bear any burden, pay any price, oppose any foe, to protect, to defend the cause of liberty around the world. In other words, we were, in a sense, going to be the world's police. And President Kennedy was fond of saying, he was fond of quoting Woodrow Wilson, that the president can be as big a man as he wants to be. And he said at a famous speech at American University in 1963, man can be as big as he wants. Now, he also said, let's put a man on the moon by the end of the 60s, and he did it. We did it. So I get it that occasionally presidents need to inspire and perhaps need to give the nation something of a goal. But in general, this book is a plea for more moderate, restrained rhetoric on the part of presidents as well, and certainly on the part of presidential candidates. Will we get there? Again, I wish I could be more optimistic. I don't know. I hope so. More importantly for you guys, you younger people here, it's going to be your country. It is your country, and you're going to be running it in a few years.
Thank you so much for the perspective on the presidency. Took a lot of notes and
You're welcome.
very. I just wanted to build on a point you were saying about electing a president who doesn't promise the world and is a decent moral person. And I hope that does happen. But I think a lot of what goes into electing the president is now social media and the press, and they choose a candidate. And we saw in the last election that a lot of information was withheld or tainted or whatever. And a lot of people read what they see on the internet, not necessarily. We all said, where are the facts nowadays? Nobody knows what to believe. So my question is, how much does the media and social media really affect the presidency? Electing the president and then maintaining him when the president does or doesn't do a good job.
Yeah.
All we know is what we hear from the press. So
Sure.
I would appreciate your.
Yeah, I don't think an Abraham Lincoln could get elected today for precisely the reasons. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but according to some accounts, he had kind of a high-pitched voice, and if you've seen pictures of him, he wasn't exactly Brad Pitt, so or John Kennedy. So in terms of telegenic qualities, a lot of those 19th century presidents wouldn't have made the cut. So yeah, media has, and I talk somewhat about it in the book, media has fueled this process as well. I will add this, and I don't see this coming back, but prior to the 20th century, for the most part, you did not campaign for president. It was considered, and there are some exceptions, but it was considered demeaning. You had, your lackeys go out there and do stuff for you. But you basically stayed, in some cases, literally on your front porch. It was, again, when Hamilton talked about the little arts of popularity, demeaning the presidency, this is exactly what he had in mind. He did not want people going out selling themselves like a bar of soap. Now, is there any way possible we could get back? Sadly, in this case, I doubt it. Now, maybe, again, that fictional candidate of mine who's got a kind of limited view of the office and of his own talents, or a more realistic view of his talent, maybe that could become part of his or her campaign. But again, prior to the 20th century, the kinds of campaigns that you and I know and expect would shock the heck out of most of the people who designed this government. Yes, ma'am.
Hello. Okay, so I'm kind of taking a 180 on my question, but you mentioned how we eroded the power of Congress through partisanship. So I was wondering if you thought the same thing about the Supreme Judiciary, if we've done this, that.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think we have. The difference there is sometimes presidents think they're putting people on the court, and once they get who have a certain ideological and judicial perspective, and then they turn out to be totally different from what they expected. So there's still a degree of independence in the courts if justices wish to exercise it. But I think certainly going back to the Bork hearings, which is probably before most of your time, arguably even there was a justice that Lyndon Johnson nominated named Abe Fortas that the Republicans blocked. It coupled with a sense on the part of many judges that they should play a more activist role, that they shouldn't necessarily hesitate to legislate from the bench. The answer, generically speaking, is yeah, the judiciary has also become more politicized. Again, presidents played a role in it. Hope that helps.
has been a highly,
Thank you.
I guess I will conclude. We have a few minutes left, maybe with a two-part question that picks up on what many of the.
Go easy on me, Meena,
Oh no,
please.
it's really building on what has been asked about elections and governance. So you've said now in response to a few questions that returning to party broker, have a more informed selection process. Does that mean, you think our system of primaries, the post needs wrap? Do we return to what was in place before that, or is it something? So that's one question. And then for governance, we've referred to your book on Bush 40 and Rush for Judgment. I just want to be clear, I think, because we'll continue this in our class discussion. Your argument today that the president, the connection between the president and the has gone contrary to what Hamilton, Washington, what the framers conceived of when they created the option. You're not arguing for less presidential power. Am I correct? So I guess that's the question about what your argument about elections and.
All right, let me do the second one first. I feel more comfortable with that one.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a great point. My conception of the presidency, for the most part, is similar to Hamilton's conception. He argued for an energetic executive, but he argued for an energetic executive within a kind of limit. And he lays out in the Federalist Papers, president should be responsible for treaties shared with the Senate with foreign governments. President, in times of war, obviously has to be the commander-in-chief. The president should do what he can to take care of the laws be faithfully executed, and the rule of law will be important to flourishing American economy. Hamilton's not an activist. He believes in an energetic executive, but he's not Woodrow Wilson. There are limits, and he seems to recognize that there are certain things the federal government should do and try to do them well and stick to that. One of those areas, clearly for Hamilton, is national security. And one of the reasons I defended Bush's actions, at least on sort of constitutional or historical precedent ground, was because I think Bush was right in that spot that Hamilton would have said a president should be. You had an attack on this country, the deadliest one since the Battle of Antietam, concerns about a follow-up attack of some sort, which Bush believed was going to happen. The CIA told him it was going to happen, probably in New York City. And he took some extraordinary measures. Extraordinary measures in terms of national security are as American as Jefferson and Hamilton and Washington. And so in that sense, I'm not calling for a limited presidency within those confines of national security, taking care of the law, be faithfully executed, etc. I hope that clarifies things. So I'm not a libertarian. I'm not somebody who, I'm not at all a believer in the sort of perspective of a Rand Paul, for instance, on national security matters, who really wants to curtail the president in that arena. That's not where I'm coming from at all. As far as the selection process, I personally, and I grant you there's probably 3 of us in this entire country, I think the primary process has been disastrous. And I think it's the brainchild of people like Woodrow Wilson and some others from his era. And I would give it back to the party leaders. But, again, I could meet probably in a phone booth with a number of people who agree. It's not.
Well, I think with that question, what next, for instance? How these changes can, and I guess in fact there's popular support for them, which an interesting conclusion to an argument that's calling for
I know. I get
less
the contradiction.
connection.
But,
Please, please.
Thanks.
Please join me in thanking Professor Knott for a very
Thank you.
instructive discussion.
Thank you all. Great questions. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.